Hello everyone, today we complete the 14th century Florentine history chapter. We will pass next time to the Medici era, fundamentally that we rarely covered on Schwerpunkt to begin with. I know that it's become a bit like the same city for the Italian section of the original historical series, but it's important, I think, to just cover at large the city's history, which well deserves such trail of videos, of episodes, and that in fact we're treating with the same degree of introductory and sort of general summary presentation. We explain, of course, the reason for this, so I will not digress further. Today we talk about a very critical moment in the history of not just Florence, Italy, or Europe, but, as you know, entire Eurasia. Just yesterday I was talking about the Hussites, observing how much of the later medieval political balance of power was shifted in considerable ways because of course, the effects of the plague, of the demographic shrinking, of the economic collapse. Florence is such an important laboratory of observation, let's say, because of the obvious role that the city had had in at least continental finance. This had been the first half of the 14th century. Florence was the richest city in the world, in the globe. It said that essentially the same living standards of Antonine Rome were reachieved only in the early 14th century Florentine society. I am skeptical, meaning, are we talking about Rome, are we talking the empire in general? Because, as you know, in general, I think that the Middle Ages were much better than the concept of, because this anecdote is like saying, the Middle Ages sucked, so Antonine Rome was the peak of everything, and nothing was as good as that. That I love very much ancient Rome at the same time, but it would be interesting to have actually more discourse on these figures, as we'll realize now, are also relatively vague, because this great medieval civilization that had already beginning to shrink in the first half, say even from the end of the 13th century, at least to stagnate, and that brusquely contracted with mid-14th century pandemic, was so enormous as relatively underdocumented, especially compared to the later medieval period. Florence is, again, another splendid point of observation for this kind of data, because Florence is basically the birthplace, exactly in these generations, the ones slightly before the Black Death, of a truly modern historiographical production and administrative recording, sort of bureaucratic organization. I say modern, I know that in English modern means up to this day, but I use the term contemporary that, as you know, I apply to basically the last couple of hundred of years or so. I should actually, in a video about Florence, explain better why I say this, what kind of authors we're discussing. Of course, if we look at Villani or Compagni, or later the same Dante, the same Petrarch, Boccaccio, in any case, this broader Tuscan civilization that did revolve around Florence, and the general political and institutional background, that is what we're mostly seeing today. Lots of things should come to mind, together with the great French, Welf, Papal, Angevin, Tuscan, Provençal axis of the era. That is really like the most advanced part of the West at this point. Florence being the center of, right? So that should be clear. But at large, especially when we come to the Black Death and also the pre-Black Death population estimates, etc., it's always complicated to actually picture how things went. There are those catastrophic figures like the plague wiped out 1/3 of the entire population. Somewhere this may have been the case, but the figures swing so much that it's not particularly clear. For example, various sources suggest that the Florentine population decreased by this enormous numbers, 40, 60%. A trend that, say, in the broader tragedy of the Black Death, of course, is mirrored in the other major cities of that era, because, of course, these were demically concentrated centers. At large, the most connected cities, centers of traffic, etc., were more exposed to anything coming from the outer side. This is debatable. There are some cities, like in Flanders or in northern Italy, like Milan, for example, was apparently spared by the plague. Now, this is also connected to the fact that we do not have much of an explicit evidence that the plague struck with such ferocity there. But why? Milan was essentially the biggest city in the continent, together with Paris. But for some reason, the same goes with Poland, certain other parts of Central Europe. Apparently, there were some sanctuaries, some shrines that were untouched by the plague, or at least where the plague did not strike so heavily. This is not the case for Florence, instead. That definitely lost a lot of people. This collapse is not entirely to be connected with the mortality. Many people fled the city, as the same Boccaccio's Decameron beautifully illustrate from a literary point of view. Furthermore, estimates fluctuate significantly. At the dawn of the 14th century, the Florentine population may be believed to have been between approximately 120 and 90,000. This was a major, of course, medieval metropolis. Subsequent losses may have diminished this figure to as few as 30,000, which I don't really think it's possible, to 50,000. Right? There may have been times in which, in the immediate aftermath, say after the first waves had struck and people had fled the more demically concentrated areas, the city was temporarily depopulated in a residential sense. Right? This is not like, I don't know, the late antiquity, which people literally, like, the cities shrunk to the degree that were large swaths of the cities like left uninhabited or unmanaged and gradually ruined. And this is not what really happened, especially in a center like Florence, in other sort of very advanced areas to begin with. So these are still tragic numbers that are a bit difficult to confirm. The earliest reliable data on population figures for Florence comes from 1427, based on tax records, so it's fairly accurate, that estimate about 70,000 residents in the city, right? And the city. Remember that the Italian communes at large still at this point have essentially as many people living in the city as much as in the surrounding district, right? So this is what we were just saying before. When you consider that many people fled the city fearing infection, which would historically, as you know, represent, like, plague in Europe lasted until the beginning of the 18th century in this cyclical fashion. I think the last time was in Marseille, I think in the 20s of the 18th century or something like that. But this would trigger some movements that we don't even have to think being just everybody's, right? When you look at Giovanni Boccaccio's portrayal of the plague in the Decameron, you realize that, of course, the people illustrated belong to this, or at least they also embody, like, the once courteous society nearing its end because of the darker temper of the time. The meaning is broader, actually, but these are definitely elite people of some sort. Literate, cultured, and more. So they would have had villas in the countryside, they would have castles, like, this is the Middle Ages. So things may have gone differently, especially for them, for us to remain so much impressed by this time. This is not to downplay the large amount of fatalities that the plague brought with it, especially we know what brutal impact it had on the system. We will see it now at a political, military, and social level as well. However, we should still bear in mind that what changes the most is fundamentally a worldview, right? The different management of power, government, this is, let's say, the second half of the 14th century is after the mid-7th, I would say the first half of the 7th, in relative, mostly psychological terms, the darkest times. Boccaccio's work, by the way, is quite interesting because it does really illustrate, very far from some kind of licentious and popular vision of the world, actually an incredibly aristocratic and elite one. Right, Boccaccio is one, but we never, I think, made a video about him. Surely we'll have to at some point from the history of literature side of the story. It doesn't happen too often, but we're talking about giants of a lot of stuff. Like Boccaccio was one of the first scholars to hold lectures of ancient Greek, right? Publicly, he was one of the greatest estimators and popularizers, and the greatest actually of Dante himself. He was very close to Petrarch. He was at the center of one of the actually most refined cultural context in 14th century Europe. And his take, of course, on the events occurring during the Black Death and afterward is one of melancholy, of romanticism. There was an illustrious past made of chivalric power, of greatness that is now shrinking, and Boccaccio is satirical to an extent, however, only because he's nostalgic of the actually good old days of actual chivalry, right? This is a problem that we have in culture, that we interpret scholars, like authors of the era, historians of the era, as if they were actually winking at us, at our own bias, so much later. Also because we just don't read, we don't study them thoroughly, right? I'm just, for example, finishing, I will submit an article, a paper on, for example, a hidden Ghibelline ideology in some of these sources that literally nobody ever wrote about. Like, check, I don't know, in the general academic catalogs, the Regesta Imperii or some other, nationals catalogs, and search for the term Ghibelline, right? How many people, how many contemporary scholars ever researched Ghibelline ideology and how and why, from which standpoints? Boccaccio is not the pop guy. Boccaccio is the one that is showing how the pop element sucked. On the backdrop of a previous chivalric valor, that is the one is pursued ideally by all the great rulers, the men-at-arms, the great houses of Florence, that you can find in the pages of Dante and more, and looked upon with admiration, even by figures that did not have that openly and overtly military lifestyle, for example, but that definitely did admire those who had. I shall make some videos about this, because people, I fear, believe that I make this stuff up, that this is so far, this is what I realize personally, that this is so far from the most basically conventional information that you've been normally provided by your educational system, your parents, etc., that you're not willing even to believe. This is a completely rational belief, of course, that there is actually like a massive chunk of this all that is simply, it's not there, not because we even wrote about that, not just me recently about that, that's irrelevant statistically, but up to a few generations ago, these were actual topics of discussion, or at least they were highlighted. It was something beneath the surface of an article, of a book that could talk about something else, about the awareness of the fact that those values were there, and that the work may have not been entirely on it, but that fundamentally was central, was recognized as central to these guys' beliefs. Just to make an example, we cited Boccaccio, as for those people who claim that I don't cite sources, by the way, that is the one about the iconography of St. George slaying the dragon from the 3rd century BC Indo-European iconography. We're talking about the role, the propitiatory role of war horses, also as they were slain ritually, etc., in the hanging. Some of you related because it's still a very recently existing thing. A couple, in fact, of 100 years ago, this fateful couple of hundred years, when things really began to change in that way to make you forget about it all. Concerning the practice of having, you see, in banquet halls and still in some older, even Disney movie representations, it's not something that people did not know up to relatively a few years ago. Having horse head, horse skulls, right, as a symbol of, again, prosperity, power, and more. Well, Boccaccio was mocking a guy who had donkey head, at the time because he was, I think, a popular guy or something, and he was mocking the heraldic, the chivalric practices. They were otherwise still alive, still failed, still, indeed, considering the bitterness of this satire, still instead very much honored and cherished in the memory and the identity, in this case, of the Florentine people. It would be really beautiful to digress more on history of literature, of art, the symbolism, etc. We do it partly here and there, but we have to talk primarily about political and military history, at least. As you understand, after the plague, the diminished workforce led to a stagnation in various economic sectors, particularly agriculture, exacerbating the plight through prolonged famine. This wouldn't actually give more power to the peasantry, as we well know from the videos about the late medieval peasant revolts. Quite the contrary. The city strengthened its grip on the countryside. This did not, however, resolve famine issues. Florence was actually lucky because with all that accumulated wealth that the city disposed of, and that, generally speaking, was able to still amass, given the sizable extent of her dominion and the general political and strategical situation, it was possible to import grain. This had been a major issue for Florence because, as we know, she did not really have a sea outlet. Like, she had to rely on allied city-states like Siena to have properly grain imports coming most from Sicily, because that's where they normally came from. You know that also in this era, the Tuscan guelphs have been subcontracted the management of the Neapolitan kingdom and of its vast agricultural resources, including, in fact, receiving the monopoly on grain imports. This had began since the time of Charles of Anjou, really as a way of repaying the wealth bankers that had subsidized the crusade. The papacy itself had relied on that. You understand why Florence also was that unoccidably black wealth, even though in a few years, as we will see now, will even declare war to the papacy. But that's how wildly, it's not like they changed in that mentality, but the general international imbalance radically shifted because of the plague effects. Furthermore, continuous wars and attacks by soldiers of fortune, free companies, I have some videos incoming on those, intensified the already challenging conditions. The latter point is very interesting and important because of the nature of Italian and European warfare at large. These are the years of the 100 Years' War. Later on, there will be the Treaty of Bretigny. You have the White Company of John Hawkwood. This is Florentine history, as we will learn quite importantly. I made a video about the condottieri in which I explained this better if you're interested more in that sort of military side of the story, even though it's about the entire Italy for a couple of centuries. What's happening is essentially this major crisis, this major unbalancement produces so many shifts in stability that even though the systems are not really threatened by these free companies, because it's not like these free companies were taking control of entire cities. or starting like their own principality on their own field. This does not happen in Italy. For example, the Germans do succeed in something like this in Scandinavia. Denmark at some point is run by a German nobleman slash mercenary on behalf of the king. There is a much greater institutional frailty, right? What the Italian city-states really do instead, which is pretty bad, at least considering the action, say the intention per se, but that objectively shows how manipulative and successfully navigating this situation they were, is throwing these freebooters against one another. Again, these companies had basically no chance to take root in the peninsula. They would loot and then go away, and different coalitions of cities would form essentially to throw some of the bigger companies, the great companies in the 40s, for example, is pretty nasty, against one another, right? And all of this is connected with the previous decades that I'm also a bit more familiar of, the role of the German mercenaries in early 14th century, especially the Ghibelline Italy, that we will also discuss further. At that point, there was also a more neatly outlined international alignment. With a crisis, universal powers shrink. You have this localization of power, this further, this coming back to the land. Also from a strictly financial point of view, investments are aiming at, for example, fortifying a great deal the already possessed territories. This is not much about strategic projection as before with larger armies, massive armies, rather consolidating what you have, solidifying it, and then eventually in the later generations passing to further expansion. Florence succeeds in this because in spite of the terrible defeats that she receives at the hand of the Ghibelline Tuscans on a regular basis, she's so big, we've talked about this in the other videos, that she takes blow after blow but still expands, mostly from the top of her financial pressure, right? Basically some communes, especially the smaller ones, Volterra, San Gimignano, etc., are literally absorbed by Florence, that consolidates as the true heart of Tuscany at this point. There are lots of other cities around that more or less maintain some autonomy, but at large, Florence is heading. These are the couple of generations, the second half of the 14th century. Like other Italian powers, like Milan, like the same Papal States, this is coming back. Venice, it's a bit later. A regional horizon, right? They consolidate as the major players in the peninsula, with lots of smaller states in between. Admittedly, we're talking all in all a dozen, something more. There's actually a big deal of territorial recompaction, paradoxically, which is what, yes, does happen also in other parts of Europe, but still with a much greater sort of overall political grip shortcoming from a territorial point of view. We were talking about this yesterday, for example, about the same Hussites revolt, how bigger systems, especially in Central Europe, went on disgregating further towards an oligarchic privatistic system. The Italian city-states do fare well. They actually pass from this provincial to a regional scale, mostly also because of the exhaustion of the smaller cities, that these other bigger ones manage to subject also through the use of free companies. I will not digress on the dynamic, because again I already discussed it from a military point of view in the video about the condottieri, but we will come back on it. In part we will see this now, but it's mostly like the international political scene that is fascinating. So in Florence, as was the case in other central Italian cities, the dire situation fueled of the time fueled a series of revolts among the impoverished lower estates. All of Europe is having issues with this. Think about the French jacquerie, think about the textile salaried workers of Flanders, of Tuscany. In fact, Florence is the stage. In this case, in this more urbanized countries, you have essentially the city as the stage of these revolts. They're quite brutal and vicious, but as the other also, the peasant ones, they do not really go anywhere, and they actually sanction and actually ease up at the end of the day the reaffirmation at least of the elite, of the patriciate, of the oligarchies. And now what actually are solid states in many ways. There is a level of privatization and general crisis that brings to smaller cities, in fact, to give way to these bigger centers, but Florence does maintain a more and actually enhances a more unitary control, at least also in terms of territorial scale. Starting in 1343, access to governmental positions was reorganized through the so-called imborsazioni. These were essentially lottery selections of candidates from a pool of names. Imborsazioni stands for basically funding of some individuals were chosen by lottery, coming mostly from the popolo grasso, the fat people, so the guild oligarchy that already ruled the state, the commune, in its unitary polity. These people were, however, filtered to exclude those considered undesirable by the ruling elite. In other words, they were paying them to become more powerful and having the means to keep out some individuals that were still seen, we've seen the justice ordinances in the previous videos, as potentially threatening the independence of the commune. Florence was a bit fixated with this. In times of crisis, it takes on a more paranoid character as a consequence. But essentially, Florence is the popolo, the commune, which means, again, this actual rich oligarchy, that as such, however, is not a monarchy, right? And they want to prevent, essentially, that from happening. Actually, this will fail, because as you know already from the end of the 14th century, the Medici will become de facto lords of the city, but still in that specifically Florentine Republican source that we will see better, in fact, in the next episode. There was specifically special magistracy of the wealth party authorized to ammonire, which means to admonish or remove, ban citizens from consideration by labeling them as Ghibellines. Right? So it was a bit like virtue signaling. Florentine politics was inexorably, again, black wealth, which we have seen now in many videos the meaning of. I will not repeat. So anybody who was perceived as Ghibelline, and mostly coming in fact from a background that could, in fact, especially from the northern Ghibelline seigneuries like Milan, infest Tuscany, roll backwards against the policy of Florentine hegemony in Tuscany, was seen legitimately also as a threat, except the banned people may have actually not been Ghibelline, and or they may have not been that specific threat to the independence of the commune. To some extent, there were good reasons for concern, but at large, this is an oligarchy that basically thickened the ranks and wants to, at least solidifies their position, and wants to seize ever more control of the system by also becoming ever more oligarchic. What happens, of course, over time, especially with the economic crisis, is the confluence of more wealth in the hands of fewer, right? What happens, for example, in Medici Florence, that is, as we have often remembered, in fact, this period where a bank, like the Medici Bank, controls the entire city, that becomes de facto lordship, is that while Florence will not actually have the same degree of absolute wealth pre-pandemic, because the system had economically imploded all over the world, the Medici were the richest bankers that Florence had ever seen in absolute terms, because they had basically cashed everything. In the early 14th century, there were many more families, including the same magistrate among the ranks, to share that power. Now times were different. It does really resemble a lot our own times. This is what I often say. It seems like today's world witnesses an acceleration in that direction. Also, the times may not be identical, but if you actually look at the years, there is a striking resemblance, even in terms of speed of how this is taking place now after a massive phase of expansion. Naturally, it's a very different reality. Things will probably develop in a different direction, but of course, for such a fragile system like the essentially agriculturally based one of pre-industrial medieval society, the Black Death does really shake the foundations of otherwise previously very well, let's say much bigger, much more extensively handled, let's say, and shared power systems. While the minor arts ascended to governance with these reforms of the 40s and the 50s, which was done in part because you could not eliminate them, and actually these discontent of the lower estates did bring at some point to a resurgency of such lower elements of representation. The captaincy of the wealth party that regulated essentially the police, right, the paramilitary system of the popolo, and thus also the wealth party within the city streets, that is fundamental for maintaining control of the city, remained a bastion for the oligarchy. So you could have, as it had always been the case in Florence, a pretty large system of representation, but with some fundamentals that basically maintain the balance in favor of the oligarchy, and actually continuously tilting in its favor. By the way, the captaincy of the wealth party, once represented organization, became at this point a tool to discredit political adversaries, as we were explaining before, with unfolded allegations of Ghibellinism, effectively barring them from public roles. So if some character was not really of their liking, they could simply obliterate him. This also resembled some forms of cancel culture that we're witnessing today. This on the same day which Elon Musk published a tweet, like quoting the famous Roman adage, "Nemo me impune lacessit." If you don't know what that means, I suggest you to check that out. This is not to say, again, I'm largely say glad of the American electoral results. However, it's not like that solves all the problems. Actually, it can create others at the same time. And these are dynamics that, believe me, like do rhyme in history, as that other motto says, and that we should take very seriously because they point to the erosion of people's quality, which is always the most pernicious aspect of civilization, which means that one side can even secure a specific regime, governance, political control, but this does not mean that in absolute terms things will just per se go better, go back to what they were before, for the better. In any case, the repercussions of the ammonire law that we've seen before, so this way of smearing your political opponents enacted in 1358, illustrate how an excessive commitment to party traditions transformed into a monopoly over the notion of homeland, aimed at selfishly maintaining the power of established oligarchs. Remember that. Because the rhetoric, of course, was always of civic liberty, of independence, but things wouldn't be that nicer than before in many ways, also for the average Florentine. And this is a broader problem. Like, this is not just about Florentine politics per se. It's just a world in crisis. So the malaise, the overall malaise of the post-Black Death condition permeates everything and everyone across countries, across cities, and it does make people worse. Like as I was saying at the beginning, think just about the art of this time, Buffalmacco, like the figure of Castruccio looking at the like in the graveyard at the rotting bodies of those killed by the plague. It's like this darker worldview that actually in proto-Renaissance Italy would quickly be surpassed. But if you look still at some places, in the later Middle Ages, in even in early modern times, in gloomier situation, let's develop like the triumph of death, the sense that everything is doomed, etc., is very prepotent, right? That, for example, proto-Protestantism that we were talking about yesterday, as far as the Hussites are concerned, is the reflection of this. Is the okay? Let's bail out of everything because it's over. We're doomed. We can't reconstitute the empire. We can't reconstitute the ecumenic rule to begin with, and so let's sabotage any kind of authority that still stands. It's also a very contemporarily identifiable feeling among the masses that historically brought nothing but disasters. Individuals from the lower estates faced exclusion from public life as well. This is reflected even at certain fairly high level of societal status. This is witnessed, for example, in historiography. I personally dislike Renaissance historiography compared to the one of the late 13th, early 14th century, because in the earlier times you had historians literally participating to public life as magistrates, as commander, as people that were really involved in all the political and military and social management of the city. They directly handled that themselves, right? Dante was a priore, Villani was a magistrate, oversaw, the construction of the Florentine walls, of military fortification. You have like a big involvement in politics. After this wave of oligarchization, also history becomes the more typically humanistic one of a courtier that basically observes the political situation from the window or from the courtly corridors, and mostly has to draw an image of reality rather than being analytical about it or simply writing for also someone else that would be involved into politics at the same level, right? So it's a completely different picture. It's the age of withdrawal. The best character incarnating this is Petrarch. Likely, it actually had a hell of a life. Probably also a very good one to live if you had to choose from a random medieval figure. But that is also one of powerlessness in many ways towards authority, towards, in fact, those who supported it, and opening to a more contemplative, also fortunately so from a philological, literary, historical point of view, as you know, from Petrarch's work, that is also very close to, of course, the Tuscan. He was Tuscan, and very close to, of course, the Florentine world to begin with. He had Aretine origins. Nevertheless, Florence was starting now to be the globe around which the entire central, at least the Tuscan civilization. People without real representations, however, were the lower masses. They lacked a representation in a guild or any right to gather even for religious purposes. You understand the degree of societal control that the Florentine commune had achieved in concert. These were some of the first places that established, for example, prisons, like long-term detention, essentially for political blackmail. This was actually a very advanced form of public and civic control. It did work very well. I mean, the system at large did hold. So, chapeau to that for such a massive system with so much lack of proclivity for example, military expansion like the Milanese, that at least had a very strong even a greater iron fist indeed. But exactly for this reason, they managed to create enough consensus in a tendentially republican system to be able to control society so well, right? This duality, so some oligarchs that had all the power and basically almost anybody else not having this, we're not even talking about, of course, the salaried workers that were often not proper citizens of Florence, but also the lower citizens of Florence who were cut out from general politics, mostly already since Dante's time, witnessed the wealth-ruling families solidifying their power while simultaneously ostracizing their political rivals and the lower estates from governance. Between 1350 and 1375, a burgeoning opposition to the popolo grasso, the fat people, emerged, composed of certain noble families, newcomers from the countryside seeking fortune, and the popolo minuto, so the lesser people, at least intended in a institutional civic sense. These were not, again, the salaried workers, whatever. These were just the lesser, like the expression of the minor arts, as we were saying before. So people with wealth, but not that monopoly on most communal institutions, who became increasingly engaged due to various initiatives. This was still one of the single most liberal systems in Europe, right? I made a video explaining how even the Italian signories are often described, were at least at some point described historiographically as tyrants, right? As tyrannies created by this, terrible. But the result, the Black Legion, it's part the either anti-Italianism or the anti-Papism. So everything that belonged to that world had to be sort of weird and corrupted in Southern Europe. Actually, this was created. It's a much later definition of the modern contemporary era from countries that literally were governed by monarchies, and they were still governed by monarchies. So nobody really understands why those tyrants that actually were some of the most liberal and sort of republican governments in Europe, so the ones where the average person had literally more liberty, would be described as tyrants, while the single most strong national monarchies were sort of, weren't they tyrants? Why should they be tyrants? You understand that the moral, apparent implications there from terms of judgment or some sort of negative bias. Remember this, because history has never been fully, I'm sure somebody wrote about these issues, but never with too much straightforwardness. It's always about some etiquette, say, somebody said this and we have to rethink. But you understand the deeper political and, the cultural, historical implications of just describing some systems in a way or another, especially when you don't have a counterpart for actually speaking up and saying, well, this wasn't actually like that. This is also why I make these videos that I enjoy, because it seems to me that literally, the entire history you've been told, I've been told at large, is not much. Yes, it's also informed by these issues, but it's like what you've not been told that bothers you the most, right? When you find that out, you start saying, so you're telling me there's an entirely parallel history that either in actual content or interpretation or whatever, nobody told us, and that is actually the more historically accurate one, and people essentially informed all their own subcultural understanding of reality in the past on this incredibly biased things instead. Well, yeah, that's the case, right? Except if you do it too often, they will say that you're a conspiracy theorist or something. But this is I take my time, as you know, to make this videos exactly to prove what I'm discussing. I say this because, of course, if I described the system as authoritarian with this oligarchy that was quite imposing, you'd think, oh my god, the system sucked. Well, actually, remember that this was one of the more liberal, meaning that you had more liberty. as an individual citizen than basically in any other part in the world at the time. And to imagine how much more iron-fisted and autocratic the other systems actually were. And I don't have to make any names here, like at least we often discuss this in general. There's an aspect about Western Europe that is truly distinct from, especially the more east you go, in many ways, that I think is pretty, at least relatively ingrained into, aside from this coming back of exoticism and obsession for the Orient and, this magic special cultures that people should be focused on without knowing even the ABC of the European ones, the place where they come from. So events prompted a reassessment of wealthism as a mechanism for political conflict, as the shifting social dynamics and increasing sort of popular influences within the priorate were leading to significant changes in foreign policy directives, which is a long way for saying that indeed this general sentiment about the need to give more space to people who did really not have it, and the shortcomings of the Florentine Republic were to at least vent as an issue towards a coherent, or at least some different, foreign policy as well. The vigorous protection of Florentine interests in Tuscany remained unabated, simply because there was no other challenging power around. We'll explain this better. Naturally, there were other cities that were historical enemies of Florence that keep fighting against her. For example, in 1364, the Florence score a victory, finally, at Cascina, overcoming the Pisan resistance and reinstated long-held trade privileges at the detriment of the Tuscan Maritime Republic. I made a couple of videos about Pisa for the historical regional series, so you can look at how, in that case, actually a very strong, very good commune with the finest military in communal Italy simply came apart, like dissolved in political dependence on Florence in the span of a couple of generations. That's really insane. In many ways, we've seen it with other regions, with other polities. In Europe, the second half of the 14th century literally witnesses this loss of independence, loss of power. The bigger one wins over the little. By the way, this victory at Cascina is not such a big clash like the bigger ones we talked in the previous video. They were all, by the way, Florentine defeats, like Montecatini, Alto Pascio, famously enough. Pisa had been actually the author of those victories over Florence. Pisa and Lucca combined. Now the Pisans were declining as well, and as you understand around, aside from the Milanese, there aren't so many immediate threats to Tuscany, because yes, there is an interesting Visconti expansionism that I also discussed in the video about Milan. We'll have, however, to go a bit more in detail, because it's a big deal, right? This is a moment in which the Milanese could sort of unite the Italic kingdom, both north and central Italy, and Florence was in many ways the bulwark, together with the Venetians, against this Ambrosian expansion that was, however, limited itself by the Black Death at large as an outcome, because actually the main results were achieved later, after the Black Death, but they were also more ephemeral because they were based mostly on this shift in political allegiance, right? Many communes preferred even to have this foreign protection, especially if they were far away from Lombardy in this case, than having some more powerful local authority telling them what to do, right? So when, for example, the Visconti dynasty crisis occurred regularly, because they were essentially a family sharing not also with a great system of succession, the Milanese signory, the Milanese power would become engulfed into some internal strife, and all the periphery of communes that had given their signory to the Visconti would sort of retake it by themselves. We have seen it for Perugia, for example, if you're interested in these Italian communes. That's a good example. It's also during this period that the relations with both the empire and the church began to decline. Florence, as we've seen, had always been a black wealth power, at least since the late 13th century. They had always backed thus the papacy, and they had received support from the Neapolitans that under the Angevins routinely sent help as one of the bulwarks of the wealth, in fact, papal axis. Now, let's say since the 20s, the 30s of the 14th century, Florence had detached herself from Naples, because it's not much that it was a toxic relation to some degree. We've seen various Angevin signories at some point in Florence that, however, were very light, right? Great credit to the Angevins for understanding that after the Swabian era, that the Italian communes could be controlled just with mild manners and attempts of cooptation that, however, at this point could not bring to the control of central northern Italy, like in the Hohenstaufen stream, were quite profitable to a degree. What Florence rather does is emancipating herself in picking mercenaries abroad, same French knights, also Germans, even though she was, well, Florence at some point starts using German mercenaries because that's basically all there is, right? And they're great at what they do. Also, the French were good for that matter, but the Germans are very available in Italy. From an autonomous standpoint, like pursuing a policy on her own and not having the King of Naples always hoping to get something in exchange, having to send his knights, and so on. Now the situation was particularly complicated. Earlier, in 1355, Florence had sought the support of Emperor Charles IV and gained favorable agreements that affirmed the legitimacy of the priorate despite its origins in internal strife and territorial gains from conquests in surrounding areas. This was a positive move because, as we've seen in the recent video about Charles IV of Luxembourg, this sovereign was wealth in nature. He supported the papacy. He had risen to power in Germany because of papal support. That's why the Germans would call him unavoidably Pfaffenkönig. It was the habit, but he had a hell of a rule, a hell of a kingdom, and as such, he could even afford to launch these expeditions into Italy at large, coupling with wealth powers. Things were not that easy. For example, he would have later problems with the CNAs. He would be besieged, like the public building. The Milanese were not really happy of his presence, but he had managed to make his way through Italy, mostly with that pacific attitude, especially in his first expedition. Otherwise, he could have not gotten the Italic crown to begin with, and then, of course, the Holy Roman Imperial one. By 1375, papal legates were reinforcing their authority over the papal states in preparation for the Pope's anticipated return to Rome from Avignon. I shall make a video about the Avignon papacy as a polity of the historical original series because it really was something on its own. I mean, technically it was the same papal states, but as an enclave between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France, it really has some very specific characteristics, and I may enucleate it conceptually as a policy on its own. There's a bit of a myth of the Babylonian captivity, of the papacy, the terrible French that handled things. This is absolutely not true. It's true that the majority of Avignonese popes were French, and that they worked in accordance with French royal policy and alignment. But not only the papacy and France were long-time allies, but the Avignon papacy kept pursuing exquisitely papal interests that were greatly within the same French ones, but actually autonomous, were not properly independent from that. Nobody forced the papal curia to move from Rome to Avignon. The only problem was, of course, that in fact the majority of papal possessions was located in central northern Italy, that Rome was, of course, the holiest of the cities in the west, and the necessity of the papacy to at some point come back there was kind of obvious. There were lots of voices rising, as we will see now, for this return. The greater issue from a papal perspective was essentially having a solid grip over the, in fact, so-called papal states. That is a term exactly used to emphasize, they weren't called like that. They were the Patrimonium Sancti Petri. And yes, technically that was in part the Lazio area. We made a video about medieval Lazio explaining a bit this, and there were these other collection of signories that the Pope had over different feudal powers, communes in central northern Italy that they had gotten over the years, also in exchange for imperial crownings, consolidating in fact the control in some areas that had been hotly contended since the time of the Matildic legacy. I recently made a video about Pope Benedict XIV during the years of the Austrian War of Succession. That shows how still there were issues with that, with France, especially at that point. The problem was to coalesce a veritable realm within the Papal States. Right? It wasn't a uniformed administration. There wasn't, like, the papacy had at large always controlled Rome and its surroundings as a veritable monarchy. These other subjects were essentially some vassals, they had been cultivated in papal obedience for the recognition of their local prerogatives. But for this reason, they had maintained some degree of autonomy, and at large, the fact that the papacy had gone over to Avignon had not greatly improved the situation, especially since the Black Death had, of course, devastated these areas as well. So what the popes do is sending figures. Think about Egidius Albornoz. We've seen him as the Archbishop of Toledo in the video about the Battle of Rio Salado. Very high-profile figure, like a military cardinal as the many. Think about Bertrand du Pouget, the cardinal legate that had fought against the Visconti back in the day, almost wiping them out of Lombardy, interestingly enough, the time of John the 22nd. At this point, the task of this guy is to coerce all these various subjects into papal obedience once again, and to also start some important civil administrative reforms in the Papal States. The legates that were sent to carry out this job were largely of French descent, and not generally, at least not well regarded by the local populace, not much because of the foreign background, but because of the impositions that they required. Of course, this entailed like paying taxes as always in order to make a state work. For a series of political and strategical reasons, including the greater military activity in northern Italy, at least with the competition of the more aggressively compact, in fact, local Ghibelline, especially signories, the greatest concentration of the papal legates was in Emilia-Romagna, so this area of northern Italy, just across the along the Apennines, right from the northern watershed, the important strategic frontier area that the papacy had acquired relatively recent in time, especially in terms of direct control over direct military presence of these legates that, again, were essentially generals, were military commanders. This area was also pretty fertile and agricultural. We've seen this well in a video about Parma that incarnates well, especially this Emilian kind of rich country. Think about the Parmesan cheese. I mean, the same kind, or ham, like the same kind of products existed at the time in spite of the devastations of the free companies and all this stuff. A reason for which Florence, that remember is still technically within the papal wealth alliance, etc., sent, because of the famines deriving from the post-Black Death, a request for grain to this papal presence. A request which Cardinal Guillaume de Noailles in Bologna, the largest center, most important one in Emilia, outright rejected. You wonder why I talk so much about the Papal States here, because the sense is that a papal recompaction of central and partly northern Italian territories equates to a threat towards Florence. Florence had sort of relaxed, saying, phew, now we may have those then Visconti in the north that are threatening us with their militaristic and expansionistic policies, but at least the Papal States is fundamentally a mess. We don't have any pressure there. Actually, we can even infiltrate it to some extent. I mean, cities like Cortona, Perugia, for example, where Cortona I don't think was within the Papal States, but it was on the frontier. Florence, as we've seen also in the previous videos, had some connections with this. The old Italia included also some Umbrian cities, and you know that those are very importantly located. With historically, think about the Byzantine corridor, the Duchy of Perugia. These are very strategic fortifications crossing the Apennines from Latium to Romagna. And this renewed papal presence, also from a military point of view, starts looking even not just defensive but potentially offensive. Right? The refusal of the papal legate to send grain to Florence to satisfy the populace's needs was viewed in the city as a strategy to undermine Florence before a potential invasion. This was particularly evident in the light of John Hawkwood's troops entering Florentine territory in Tuscany, despite the legate's quick denial that Hawkwood's ongoing service to the church had anything to do with. At least he denied even that he was at the service of the church to begin with. But the guy was literally moving with papal supplies, including ones that the legate should have sent to Florence, to actually invade Tuscany with an army. You understand here what's going on. The papacy thinks that the international coordinates wealth gibbeling seems to have completely exploded, jumped. This is true already from some decade. Here it's a free-for-all, everybody against everybody, almost. At least there are some alignments, but they're mostly new. And most military action during the Black Death aftermath had yet to be seen. There weren't so many resources to carry out certain expansionistic policies. All this is happening in a pretty strained cultural temper. For example, within the lower estates, many people were incited by the semi-heretical so-called fraticelli, which means little friars in Italian, that were essentially in fact, an heterodox spin-off of the Franciscan order, who opposed the wealth of the Avignon court. It's always the same story, down the rich, etc., stirring up discontent among the Florentines, especially in times of war now, and leading to a declaration of war of the city against the same Holy See. It also spurred rebellion, by the way, in other cities under papal control, so Florence showed that she had some cards to play. By the way, the presence of John Hawkwood, as you know, is unsurprising. This was essentially the most successful of the Free Company's leaders, essentially before the advent of probably the Italian condotta, starting more or less from just after his times, or from the later years, later decades of the 14th century. The White Company, these mostly English veterans of the 100 Years' War that had seen it all before, these were very fine troops, scored lots of victories, were also defeated actually by the Italians, who, for example, did not really, or other nationalities in Italian service at that point. There were a lot, also in fact serving in the White Company, that, for example, did not adopt the longbow, did not really care so much about the tactical system. It actually was pretty much the same of the rest of Europe. As you know, I have made lots of videos explaining why there is nothing actually special about using the longbow over the crossbow and vice versa. These were actually great soldiers because they were great soldiers. And Clausewitzionly speaking, I will never stop saying it, warfare is about moral forces, right? It's not about what kind of weapon you use or another. These guys knew their deal. They knew it well. They scored victories with their longbow as well, but not because of the longbow as a 50% plus one reason of their victories. And it's really a pretty intricate and brutal time in history. Now, in response to this war, this emergential state, a special magistracy called the Otto di Guerra, so the Eighth War, was established in Florence. By 1376, Bologna, heavily funded by Florence to instigate a rebellion in the heart of the papal legate's signory, joined the alliance. Right? Bologna is just across the Apennines. As we've seen, it had always been very wealthy. And at this point, they are growing a bit fed up of the same papal presence because the Bolognese want a signory on their own. They will actually remain under the papacy. But in this case, they rise up against the legate. Shortly thereafter, John Hawkwood demonstrated his might with a massacre in Cesena, where apparently 4,000 people died. Maybe the numbers are inflated, but John Hawkwood is a guy who apparently finding two of his men fighting over a nun, for whom of the two would rape her, took the Solomonic decision to cut her in half with his sword, which at least put an end to the torture that she would have undergone. I mean, you may never say that she would have better been alive even after, whatever would have happened to her. But I mean, this is an anecdote, by the way. It's not like the English men-at-arms of the White Company would have been, I don't know, particularly sensitive individuals to things like human mercy, right? You had one famous, at that point actually German free company commander that had, well, marked on his armor, enemy of God, enemy of mercy, enemy of piety. Bernard von Urslingen, the leader of the aforementioned so-called Great Company. Many of these guys also had some interesting redemptional stories. The German Malherbe, for example, was defeated by the Milanese, and after that he had already taken vows to go over to the Crusades, and he died, in fact, in the siege of Smyrna in Anatolia. John Hawkwood had a similar story because eventually he will serve the Florentines, as the beautiful monument in the dome really proves. On March the 31st, 1376, Pope Gregory XI excommunicated the Florentines because of the war, declaring, by the way, any debts owed to them as void and expelling 600 Florentines from Avignon itself, seizing their properties. So, bitter hatred between the two powers. For a mercantile city like Florence, of course, not getting all the debts paid with all the branches they had, all the banks scattered across Europe, but not getting their credits back actually was pretty nasty issue. There were ways to recover this, but not as during the war. As a prominent Guelph stronghold, Florence would enter into open war with Pope Gregory XI. This may seem as a paradox, but the War of the Otto Santi, as it would be later called, was really that exemplificative of the times. It witnessed the reconstruction of ecclesiastical authority in Romagna as well, which would remain, in fact, in papal hands and one of at least the local lordships the condottieri were subjects of the papacy. Were some also the Papal States had some of the finest condottieri when the Italian phase began at this point, essentially. They had it been a united kingdom with a greater solidity as a proper monarchy, the Papal States would have literally taken over Italy. There's no doubt that their manpower, their warlikeness in the major Roman, Umbrian, Romagnol houses was astonishing. He would provide the best leaders of the following generation. Alborno's mission was all baked into this because Romagna's papal consolidation was definitely a product of the legate's work. That the Florentines now were threatening, especially in its territorial integrity. The war, during which Florence firmly adhered to the interdict, exposed significant rifts among the St. Guelph oligarchs within the city and the new, less compliant factions that supported the war negotiations. In fact, led by the Council of the Eight Citizens, the Otto Santi, which means the Sanctioned Eight, the Holy Eight, as they aimed to establish the moral validity of their resistance against the Pope, which was unheard of, especially from Florence. No power had ever simply gone at war against the papacy. At large, there were some excommunicated rulers like the Visconti back in the day that were attacked by the papal armies during crusades, but this simply like treating the Papal States as an enemy just per se, and mostly for political territorial reasons rather than broader international ideological issues, is a very regional thing to do. It's very Italian at this point in history, and it reflects also some unsettled issues within the conception of universal powers. During such turbulent time, public outrage culminated in an arson attack on the residence of Saint Catherine of Siena, the famous spiritual figure and pacemaker in this case, who, due to her earnest faith, became an unwitting tool of the factional leaders. When Catherine, an important mediator between Florentine and papal interests, successfully facilitated the Pope's return to Italy, traveling from September the 13th, 1376 to January the 17th, 1377, new negotiations were initiated, yet they failed to produce the expected outcomes. Catherine of Siena was a great proponent of the papal coming back to Rome for broader international reasons. There is also a proto-national unitary feeling stemming from this, right? The idea that Italy, not just the Papal States, needed Rome as her capital, as it would happen, half of a millennium later, in a general sense. It is quite fascinating for the 14th century, also considering that just 1,000 years before, the Roman Empire was there. It was understood, also in this broader classicistic temper of the times. Remember the recovery of the classics, Petrarch, Boccaccio, it's the same times showing the necessity for some civic republican reordering. These signories that have taken over Italian politics are now, as we're saying, actually, in spite of all these dark pages that we're reading, being able to consolidate some more than provincial, now tendentially regional powers. And this had been possible only because there had actually an important level of administrative improvement, of organization. It wasn't random. It was understood that a balance of power, for example, within the Italian states, was something necessary. Right? This is way before the Treaty of Lodi of the following century. But it's already expressed by some key figures, also Catholic spirituality, like Catherine from Siena, that, by the way, was a Tuscan, as you understand from the name. Following a truce with Bologna, that had at some point changed also in regime, the Florentines opted to recruit the same John Hawkwood to their cause. We are in April 1377. The Florentine clergy contended with severe taxes and were forced to reopen churches and conduct services, because now the commune needed money to go on funding the war, especially hiring this magnificent company commander that cost really a lot. So they began to tax the clergy as well. This is yet an affirmation of secular authority, especially in a war in which Florence was literally fighting against the papal states, so against the same Roman Catholic authority. This was, however, a measure that the Florentine clergy, say, contributed to, even if with imposition, as Florentines at large, as part now of this state that, as we were just saying, was consolidating further, also throughout these crises. The obstinacy of the 8 saints of the Otto Santi whose refusal to resign had become the sole point of contention with the Pope was resolved through the efforts of the Milanese Lord Bernabo Visconti. This is quite interesting because actually there were multiple powers, including Milan, supporting Florence in this war against the Papal States. In many ways, probably because they thought that a weak Papal State could be infiltrated. There were lots of rich but divided central Italian cities that were habitually also participating in this rivalry between Florence and Milan. So at large, even if these powers did not like each other very much, they thought that undermining papal power in the reconstitution of the Patrimonium Petrum was actually a viable opportunity. Now, however, the war had dragged on too much, and the Visconti organized a negotiation conference that took place in Sarzana, that is on the Tyrrhenian Sea, a Genoese territory. We are on March the 12th, 1378. This conference was actually posed just a few days later on the 27th of March due to the passing of the Saint Gregory XI. With the election of Urban VI, a peace agreement was finally reached, which was signed on July the 28th, 1378 in Tivoli, near Rome. The papacy, as you know, will have some problem in fully restoring itself in Rome. There would be a major schism in the following decades. That's all. Actually, I never made a video about that, but it's such a huge deal that we'll have to make several videos about it just to introduce, especially considering how much we've made of the papacy so far already. The Florentines had essentially to back down, right? They agreed to pay a sum of 250,000 florins, which is a lot, right? It's a regional scale kind of toll. Consider that some cities had been bought for several tens of thousands of florins, right? So this is a big deal. Only, by the way, to have the interdict lifted. That tells you how still strong Florentine finance was internationally, just to pay so much, just to continue cashing. There was only a partial payment of this amount at the end of the day, but it was one condition for the end of the war. After significantly impacting the outcome during the War of the Eight Saints, the Popolo Minuto again raised their concerns, presenting a series of demands that indicated a major shift within the Republic's institutions. 1378 is such a fateful year in Florentine history, as you know. It shows, just as we've seen in the previous decades, in the previous episode, that after the Battle of Lucca of 1341, the people sort of managed, the popolo proper managed to make a comeback on the institutional stage against the oligarchs. The outcome of a battle, especially a defeat, or the outcome of a war that had not gone too well for Florence, would usually trigger this kind of regime modifications, at least, and even uprising attempts of rebellion from some estates. Remember that other cities were literally knocked out after major open field defeats. ending up under somebody else's seigneury. Florence is still so big and powerful that does not yield to anyone, but does have interesting internal upheavals that surely do not improve the general health of the institutions, at least in that tendentially, say, hopefully representative direction that paradoxically these guys were kind of fighting for, right? So these were the people who at the end of the day sabotaged the system, eliminating even the last possibilities for them to be actually represented in the attempt to actually get some representation. This is very interesting. We'll have to open a parenthesis in some other video regarding the political implications for today's history, let's put it this way. In fact, the Popolo Minuto staged a populist insurrection. This is what it gets down to, make a bit of a circle with words, but this is the word populism. That's what ruins the whole thing, even when backing positive ideas. Look at what is happening now, right now. People saying, we need representation, we need the truth, we need whatever. But do you think that these people are actually going to get any of that? Their individual conditions just going to improve. They're going to have more liberty in relative terms. That's not going to happen. It's interesting to see that, of course, in later Middle Ages, the overall absolute conditions tended to improve, right? If you look at on the very long term, also the Renaissance and beyond, like the average person was living better, say, in the previous years, but in terms of relative liberty, they radically lost it, right? It was the system who took care of them, so to say, but also with this very autocratic bias. The 1378 populist insurrection was notably significant as a peak of this Popolo Minuto's revolution. The social history of Florence reflects thus a variety of experiences, particularly as the minor guilds began to infiltrate the oligarchic sphere. It had been gone for decades now, and it had been bugging the establishment. In this context, the lesser people wage earners from the larger guilds, especially the Wool Guild, looked at this and said, look, we are exploited as salaried workers, we don't have anything. And they decided to no longer accept their exclusion from corporate rights as well. There were many useful idiots, violent people. The masses have that primordial hatred that you can successfully channel with a rational policy and some taste for military gamble, except at large this group was not like the better element of the government. In the pursuit of such populistic rights, the lesser people increased their demands on public authorities, culminating even in a forceful takeover of the Palazzo dei Priori, which was the public palace, like the one of the Signory today, but that is effectively the one of the Priori regime that existed from the 13th century. On July the 21st, 1378, the lesser people appointed as gonfaloniere, which means the guy that carries the banner of the people, Michele di Lando. This led to the outbreak of the so-called Ciompi tumult, the Ciompi Revolt, in July 1378, where the laborers of the Wool Guild, referred to as Ciompi because that was the name of these workers, called for higher wages, better living conditions, and formal recognition of their profession as a guild. This often also happens in times of populistic uprising, from directions that you don't even understand anymore, like whether it's right or left wing. It's basically national socialism to some degree. It's some populistic bias, and it doesn't really lead very far unless the institutions side with them. Of course, the institutions do not like this lesser people to begin with, but focus on protests, violence, even just for the sake of itself. What do you want in the end? We would like to take over, right? In fact, for perhaps the first time in Europe, in the case of the Ciompi Revolt, what could be called without any communistic sympathy, proletarian working people, I would have added class if I had been a Marxist, but thank God I'm not, sought enhanced rights, and their protest was unexpectedly met with rapid success. Nonetheless, while the so-called people of God, notice how here the moral element, like we are the better ones, right? We are the special ones, we are the martyrs of the situation. Remember, look at social media, look at how people behave today. They are the poor scapegoats of the entire situation. They're not never the problem, right? They are only the victims, of course. Did not hold back and achieved 3 groundbreaking laws. So they actually went somewhere with this. They actually had themselves felt, heard. This essentially entailed gradual direct taxation, rejection of public debt, and acknowledging of the Ciompi as a recognized guild. This aspect, as you understand, is very, preposterous, especially the rejection of public debt. The gradual direct taxation meant that, in the Middle Ages, people were not socialistic parasites. Everybody paid the same. The same goes with Rome. So at large, those who are richer pay more in absolute terms, and those who pay less pay more. Of course, these lesser elements, the salaried workers, etc., were squeezed in incredible ways. It's not to say that they weren't exploited or they didn't live in, sewer conditions, especially after the plague that had struck very much their estate, also because of lower, they just ate bread, basically. They had lower immunitary defenses, but at large, it's mostly a political issue, right? These people want to pretend that Florence does not have even to recognize it has a public debt of some sort. Remember that what had happened during the Otto Santi War was exactly about this. The papacy had said, you have some greater business around. There's this money scattered all over the various Florentine banks, branches all over Western Europe and beyond. The Ciompi say, we want essentially this debt to be either repaid or for the sake of the internal re-equilibration of power. Also, they wanted to literally be recognized politically as a guild on their own, and so being part of the government. This episode is very famous, right? I never made a video specifically about this, nor for Italy, that is the more famous example, but also for Flanders, because these were essentially the places where the late medieval crisis revolts took the form of urban uprisings rather than peasant revolts, for obvious reasons. But it's one chapter we should analyze far better, because it has long-ranging implications that are better understood in the broader context, of course, of Florentine history. That's why I make this series, when considering especially the underlying factors that led to it, right? Which is truly at this point not much, as always, really, not much the fact that these people had any specific power on their own. It's just apparent, right? What has happened here is the fracture within the oligarchic alliance. Essentially, there are some oligarchs that are able to make leverage on the lesser people in order to gain favors for their own faction that will ultimately get rid of the Ciompi as soon as possible. In fact, almost immediately. A few years, really, but this is upsetting enough because it was such an affront to the historical preeminence of the Popolo Grasso, its financial power, right? This greatly diminished, in fact, together with the unity within the political parties due to the influence of these various interest groups. In other words, the once proudly united oligarchy of the fat people that had withstood attempts of coup d'etat by some autocrats that had managed to stand its ground against multiple enemies in Tuscany and abroad and so on, decided to backstab one another as a symptom of the moral collapse of the great medieval civilization, making Florence essentially losing that more shared, like sort of republican regime and leading the path to the rise of the Signory, because it's essentially from these clans that eventually the Medici will rise. The Medici were actually not among the more powerful at this point. Actually, they emerged because we will see how it happened really, but they managed to oust also the bigger, more traditionally powerful Florentine clans, or the fat people, great powerful bankers, by surpassing them also from a financial point of view. The ruling oligarchy thus evolved into an elite faction primarily consisting of wealthy landowners that were fighting over the control of the commune. Their authority was increasingly contested by the ambitions also of this rising mercantile element that would back, in fact, some of these non-full elite for countering the latter, always in an oligarchic frame set. This led, needless to say, to familial conflicts exhibiting two main approaches. One faction, represented by families like the Albizzi, these were the most powerful guys, sought to centralize power, aiming to solidify an oligarchic system reminiscent of that in Venice, where the lock of the major council had happened a century before. I made a video about this, specifically, in fact, about how it happened for Tuscany and Venice, but in previous generations. Then you had the other faction, disturbed by warnings about the state affairs, aspiring to ally with extreme, say, populistic groups that had long been marginalized, hoping to achieve a bold vision of tyranny, even. This is very, very interesting because essentially, unlike Venice, in fact, that had always a very strong political control in a very unitary direction, regardless of the various patrician families of the Venetian Senate, that would remain, in fact, always the same, did pay, in fact, Florence did pay for the lack of a more cohesive power concentration. Right, Milan wouldn't pay for this. Right, it was just one family at the top, and so it remained. They could be substituted by another family, but it was a tendentially monarchic regime, regardless of the fact that Milan was also a commune. So this is always the point. There isn't like the disappearance of the commune or the substitution of the commune with the signory. Right, they coexist. There is a signory over the commune. The communes live into the contemporary Italian administrative system. Like, they never vanished as local government. It's interesting to think it in this historical perspective. Now, the dissenting faction from the entrenched oligarchy ignited the initial unrest of the Ciompi, by the way, who eventually retreated as the movement's volatility escalated, only to re-emerge, by the way, when the backlash began. It would be these internal rifts, intentionally heightened by the popolo grasso, to lead to the swift downfall of the Ciompi and the revocation of their reforms by the year 1382. Right, so this mess went on for 4 years, just to have essentially the oligarchic system rebalancing and overthrowing these guys. The decline was gradual, as the defeat of the Ciompi was followed by yet another 4-year period of governance by the minor guilds, which had a moderately, say, popular nature, but again, run always by people with money. That's the point. During this era, the oligarchic dissenters such as Tommaso Strozzi, Giorgio Scali, and Benedetto Alberti, these are from the other great families. I mean, the Albizzi, Strozzi, Scali, Alberti, these are the most powerful bankers embodying the Florentine elite, returned to the forefront. Right, they had always been behind the curtains, directing lots of things, anticipating a premature shift in public approval. They were ultimately exhausted themselves. Nevertheless, this governance, marked by oppression and fear, resulted in the executions of notable citizens, including Giannozzo Sacchetti, Piero degli Albizzi, and Donato Barbadori. Remember, these are extended and extensive clans, so some individuals could be scapegoated depending on how personally compromised they had been with previous, especially with the Ciompi issue. At this point, highlighting the inability of the Popolo Minuto to effectively participate in the administration of the Florentine commune, signaling the final decline of the Popolo in Florence. This is yet another major issue. Like, if you wonder how the Medici eventually rose, regardless of the popular, say, fiction that was maintaining Florence because of this very old tradition, the age of the popolo as a form of government was over. Remember, the popolo is not the people, the lesser people, it's this system that had emerged in opposition to the milites, to the magnates that de facto expressed the priori, the guilds, all this stuff. This moment sees the necrosis of it all. Right? The oligarchic restoration of 1382, cemented under the dictatorial rule of Maso degli Albizzi alongside his closest associates Niccolò da Uzzano and Gino Capponi, managed to stabilize the state and prevent further turmoil until the emergence of the Medici. Similarly to Milan, a more autocratic government was actually bringing to the pacification of the community. If in Florence this had not happened before, regardless of all the historical differences between, say, Tuscany and Lombardy, specific city-states, from one another, was the necessity to purge, fundamentally, those components of the community that would have not gone down without a fight, silently, and reinstating this ever more elite system. However, the Republican framework was all but exhausted, because you see, it's not like at some point the councils were disbanded, the commune did not exist anymore. As we said before, even towards a tendentially seigneurial government, the Republican institutions continued to exist. Of course, ever more emptied of their actual power, in more superficial, with more superficial attendance to the same, and de facto power could be wielded from them. I made a video about Cosimo de' Medici's reform to understand how he simply bypassed the system by de facto creating, also just in terms of practical, as a practical solution, like a parallel cabinet on his own that de facto ruled the city. But it was not possible to eliminate those councils, the communal framework, right? That had, however, in terms of internal vitality, completed a cycle exposing both the failings of popular governments and the vulnerabilities of the oligarchic system itself. Remember this in times of crisis. People do not get actually anything. Even when they try to rise, they actually make it worse for themselves. And the same oligarchic system tendentially fails, tendentially brings to further power concentration, because it's simply inefficient in its plurality. So reason very well about this, because there are different ways this manifests in history. It's not just like saying, I don't know, fascism rises, whatever. It can be more subtle, right? And it can even bring to better periods, right? But it does through a, let's say, at least the elimination of what was previously understood as the conventional form of citizenry, for example, of liberty, and more. The resolution to the state's challenges could no longer arise from the unstable oligarchy, which had ultimately contributed to the crisis itself between 1378 to 1382. I mean, if other great example here, if the Ciompi could rise as the people at some point, just because somebody else put them there, and they never actually ruled per se. If any uprising, any rebellion, even revolution, this is the actual reality. The people never rule, right? The people just, in absolute terms, never actually rule. It's impossible for direct so-called democracy to exist to begin with. That's why we have a government. Otherwise, I don't know, what would we do? Nobody would even know how to implement anything. People never decide. Like, people vote to elect people that will do things on their own, right? And then, of course, these people may be taken out to somehow follow in part what the people said, but it's not like the people at large know how to do that or how difficult it is, of what stands in between. They have zero understanding of that, right? And so all these internal conflicts are never useful. The Albizzi family, also known as the Albizzi with a single Z, were willing to resort to violence, for example, in order to maintain their power. This is also typical. There is ever more violence that initially manifests as increased rates of crime for whichever societal issue, and then this becomes normalized. People become less sensitized to violence, to open discrimination. They actually want that. Does it sound familiar? By controlling the electoral lists, they formed a strong coalition of families capable of overcoming their adversaries, initially the Ricci and later the Alberti, who had appealed to lower social estates for support. I would like to stress that this is also a moment of great prosperity of these peoples. If you visit Florence, for example, you have all these magnificent palaces of. Now, I inserted some of them in the pictures, of course, because they date back to that time. They're massive fortresses. This is the first thing that you actually realize about them. These people lived in an incredible amount of wealth, power, prestige, and they really knew their deal in terms of controls of the urban landscape. So it's never something random. All right, they are the city. Right, the importance is how dependent they are on one another. There's all the banking system behind this that today we haven't discussed, but it's incredibly fascinating to study because you realize that largely this guy's patrimony equated to the degree of influence they had in the city. Of course, at least it was mirrored by that. While the Albizzi represented the established oligarchy, they were really the finest elite. Newly affluent urban families rallied at this point around the Medici, who gained favor among the medium and minor guilds, setting the stage for war. Never also exchanged these clans just for bankers. Right? The Medici are to be found even in the 1342-43 uprisings as defending as men-at-arms their own houses, participating to uprising. It's that kind of lifestyle. Don't be fooled by the mercantile appellative that often these republics are received. These are highly warlike systems. They're tendentially disarming the populace. This is true. Otherwise, they would have not started to hire free companies. There is all that, right? Especially their urban lifestyle is very it's very civilized. Actually, other European courts will start imitating these guys, as you know, later also marrying with them. So, and vice versa, like this more patrician regimes tended to adopt part of royal outward characteristics. However, they also are very involved into military affairs. The Medici, as you know, will actually enter Florence with the backing of an army. So it's not really some random reality. The commune has its own forces. There is an exquisitely strategic dimension to the control of the city. It's not just like some strange movement. It's all very tied to the actual logistics, right? To the capacity to control the city as a major organism. During this period of oligarchic dominance, Florence enjoyed, by the way, renewed economic success. Finally, after a generation from the Black Death, there is a recovery. Also, the oligarchic recompaction of power towards the seigneury is a proof of that. This is a state, this recompacting, right? There's beautiful art, there's more wealth there is demographic recovery. There is this broader alliance with Venice against Filippo Maria Visconti's quest for political control in Italy. We made a video about the guy, mostly for early 15th century policy. So we are entering a new time. The time, for example, the now exclusively Italian condotte, very different from the one of a few decades before, which these troops were all mostly foreigners. It's a new readjustment. You understand that all this malaise, all this disease, at the end of the day, also hit some power built up that was definitely spent in that more oligarchic, typically post-14th century crisis, autocratization of power across Eurasia, even in such, again, liberal republican regimes. The weakness within the internal orders became increasingly clear in the face of mounting external threats. The Republic was surrounded by rival lordships. Thus, the threat coming from reinforced enemies was also the other side of the coin. This produced concern voiced as early as the rise of tyrannies in the early 14th century. Florence already portrayed itself as the center of liberty, civic liberty, of republican tradition, whereas Milan would have been allegedly the tyranny, except at the time the tyranny was used in a positive sense, and in the case of Milan it also worked pretty darn well because it was the more state of all the Italian states. I think one of the very earliest videos on Schwerpunkt on this topic, the double stereotype between Milan and Florence. Naturally, it was a lot of hypocrisy from the Florentine side, as you understand. They would become essentially a signory, but they were acting as if they were a republic. Florence had to beware now, because the encirclement by other powers included formidable states like across the Italian peninsula. The initial threat, as we were saying before, arose from the north, all right, with the Visconti state that was centered in Lombardy and tended to expand towards Tuscany because it was the most usefully developed part of Italy to reach from there. Major Tuscan civilization, so rich and divided, offering great opportunities for a more compact militaristic signory. In the mid-14th century, the Archbishop Giovanni Visconti had definitely threatened Florence. This was the guy after the death of which Charles IV could come to Italy, pass through the same Milan and Tuscany, Rome, because the Visconti did not like as Ghibellines Charles IV, that as we've seen was essentially a papally backed ruler. Dynastic crisis, power discontinuity, Florence manages to gain breadth. However, later Gian Galeazzo Visconti aimed to expand once again in central Italy. We are between 1388 and 1402. I explained these things in the video about medieval Milan. But the Lombards were not the only threat. For example, between 1409 and 1414, King Ladislaus of the Kingdom of Naples launched a campaign against Florence. This was just dictated by different issues that were happening in the Angevin kingdom, and with the papacy, with the issues also that this had kept having with Florence to a degree. It's still the age of soldiers of fortune, and the condotte again are ever more Italian, but the dynamic of these companies roaming around is still there. It's still very active. Made multiple videos about the typical condottieri era battles, included recently with Caravaggio, that sort of exemplified that. Despite these challenges, Tuscany was relatively well enshrined within her political, strategic, geographical boundaries. The Florentine oligarchic government effectively maintained a defense in the region, and even achieved a long-sought victory between the two invasions. That is, as we explained in the video about medieval Pisa, the conquest of, in fact, the Tuscan Maritime Republic from 1402 to 1406. This was a major step forward because Florence had historically always been struggling against Pisa for centuries to get finally the access to the sea. Pisa controlled most of the Tuscan coastline, and especially was a pretty bulky power located, in fact, on the mouth of the Arno River, that is the same river Florence, that is up in the valley. So this chapter is a major victory for Florence that also opens to various different humanistic issues. We've seen it often, for example, in the videos about medieval law. There's the famous Pisa manuscript of the Corpus Juris Civilis that the Florentines use to reconstruct. Eventually, they pass it to the Bolognese school, but let's say the city-states had remained almost not sealed from one another because they were the same people and they spoke the same language, etc. But they were incredibly well entrenched. We've seen it also recently in that video about the Italian city walls that are one of the most important yet forgotten chapters in military infrastructure, in archaeology, etc., exemplifying the splendor of medieval civilization. They would well treasure in their fortified palaces and more. Lots of treasures, lots of manuscripts, lots of relics, of symbols of power that were quite coveted by these guys. For example, the only source that we have about the list of the members of a medieval army in absolute terms is the Book of Montaperti, that the Florentines lost together with their camp at the Battle of 1260 against the Siennese. And when in the 15th century Florence seizes Siena, they find these essentially rolls. They're just a list of the guys that were part of the army. And they bring it back to Florence. And it's literally the only source of that kind to know how actually, in a bureaucratic sense, an army was really composed. Not that we don't know otherwise, but it's always relatively vague. Not even the condotta or the indenture actually tells us like the entirety of an army. Technically, not even Montaperti describes the entirety of it, but it's still the best source and probably a unique one of that kind in the entire medieval history. So it's like for military affairs, it's really important. But the capture of Pisa is so epochal because Pisa had really been the main problem for Florence in Tuscany since ever. And this accomplishment fulfilled the long-standing goal of connecting Florence to the sea, which didn't make things too easier, right? For example, this conquest intensified the ongoing constitutional crisis in Florence because there were much greater interests at stake. The friction escalated, for example, between Florence, driven by, as we've seen, these oligarch interests, and the subordinate Pisa, which sought independence amidst escalating tension. So calling external powers, that's always the dynamic. Efforts to unify the provinces into a larger state formation faltered because local governments were protective of their newly acquired privileges. Thus, the historical task of establishing a principate in Tuscany fell upon those marginalized from within and those subjugated from without, as well as the uneven power dynamics that Republican Florence faced against the Visconti Duchy, that was essentially the one now infesting once again Tuscany for good, while Venice was essentially creating a terra firma signory that would also help Florence, in fact, counterbalance Milan. Well, we made, again, the video about the Battle of Caravaggio, also about the Battle of Molinello, that are all moments in which the Venetians actually were stopped, which the Venetians had really the best army, really, especially in the second half of 15th century Europe. When you look at the general ways it was organized, the The sense being, however, that the say Italian politics was becoming ever more heated, ever more complicated, ever more dangerous. As a matter of fact, Florence, as you know, we'll see it better in the chapters about the 15th century, will not be able to essentially prevail as a strong regional force. It mostly stuck with a provincial dimension, whereby they tended to, of course, being an important tip of the balance. It's not like they didn't have power, but differently from the earlier days in which Florence, as we've seen, especially in the moment of the peak of popular strength, could field an impressively large amount of troops, as many as Milan, even more on multiple theaters at a time. Even the later Florence becoming, with all these various political issues compounded, there's also the military, the economic shortcomings, etc., will prefer to pay mercenaries every once in a while, and for the rest trying to avoid prolonged engagements. This is really a policy we've seen as a limit of an era that would stretch. We're talking about this was for the 7 Years' War, for that matter. Never underestimate how impacting and long the late medieval crisis really was, and how slowly this powers recovered from that massive blow, right? At the same time, Florence does at least maintain her own control over most of Tuscany. Siena, for example, that was historically allied to her, will become a bit more of a rival in later times, and it occupied a good half of at least the southern part of Tuscany, that was pretty big, was not so developed like the Arno Valley in the north that Florence basically had expanded on as the natural basin of expansion. But the overall picture of the region is dominated by Florence. Florence will historically maintain some sort of Republican bias. This is true also for the later Grand Duchy of Tuscany. For example, also during the Habsburgic era, this was some of the most liberal powers ever. They were some of the first to abolish death penalty, things like that. Like, we're very civilized, very literate. But at the same time, they maintained, I would say, a confederal profile of power. That's what it got down to at the end of the day. It was this Republican fiction whereby power was never like annexating another community. Well, this wouldn't happen even with the other seigneuries, but let's say there wouldn't be much of a attempt, for example, to unify the administration, etc. Florence wanted to remain as if nothing was really going on. Don't worry, we're just, some bigger brothers. There is nothing shady going on. We're just, subjugating you, but we're not really claiming this as simply conquering you or whatever. This is it would have been useless. What would have been the point? That this city is already depended on Florence, and they gradually were subsumed. And this is also, today we didn't talk about it so much, but we have to think that these were some of the most booming moments in the Renaissance. We'll talk about this in the 15th century chapters, because there is a lot going on in terms of art, of literature, of general production, and philology, the recovery of the classics. Florence is becoming the true cradle already in the 14th century of humanism, and that's what you fundamentally get from there on without interruption. At least in the 16th century, the real capital, the Renaissance, would become Rome, but Florence was really the beginner of this. It's incredible how this culture, the civilization, developed from a single city at large. It was already part, of course, of a very developed region and country, but the peculiarity of Florence is striking. It's really, it happened mostly because of the previous era compared to the ones we discussed today. But at the same time, it's like I say, Florence collects this legacy, and that there's not even need to do that because that's what they felt they were. Right? They were the same people. They were the same thinkers. They had developed this more popular sense of themselves, this need of a republican regime, and everything follows fundamentally that direction. Surely, it's all more. You understand how ruthless this power is. Like it's all particularly brutal. There are so many different issues going on. The republican liberties are fundamentally annihilated. Nevertheless, the spirit of the city lived on and became ever more characteristic. You can argue that this is also interesting because Florence, as other cities, city-states, has now this more regional character, and this tends to essentially characterize more this power. It's not like a power like the others. In previous times, you can say that Florence would have been a power like others, but there is a more similarly, a more commonly experimenting kind of, let's say, of military, so political, military, and social profile that later becomes ever more fixed in the prejudice that, for example, what I was just saying, the fact that Florence would later be known for not wanting to spend too much money for the army. Well, it's a typically Machiavellian thing, right? It stemmed from those times. It did not quite exist before in the same sense. On the contrary, Florence was quite militarily active. Unfortunately, people remember the Italian communes mostly for the later signories. I discovered this, that people think that the later signories were sort of more important as a whole than the previous medieval civilization. This is not really true in relative historical terms. The previous ones were much more important, much more active, much bigger, also in absolute term, in size. Right? So it's a problem. Because before making, I had an idea, but before making videos about these topics on YouTube, I had no idea how strongly felt this aspect actually was, right? We will nevertheless be able to understand this better when looking at the Medicean regime, that in many ways remain the tip of the balance in Italian politics. They worked really as a power that could have been obliterated by neighbors, right? And that, however, was eventually able, just out of sheer political prowess, this is mostly the genius of Cosimo and Lorenzo de' Medici, to maintain the Italian balance of power for long, in a condition of, at that point, of stalemate that had basically produced itself in terms of Venice plus Florence versus Milan, Naples, etc. History is quite interesting, as always, and the most important thing is to get it well, right? To really get that kind of information makes you realize, okay, then I got what happened here. It's not even about strict explanations. It's just realizing how, like, when something makes sense, you kind of feel it even beyond these words or through the words. You kind of get the general balance of this all. Then you realize also how important it is and how why nobody ever told me, like, why is it that this picture that makes so much sense is somehow not out there, not adequately told, right? I make these videos, I don't know how many people watch them, because usually when I make these topics, especially about the Italian communities, I do realize that people are not habituated to them. They just mostly don't understand the ultimate meaning of them in cultural perspective. But this is also why, as the only person who actually discusses the topic, I think it's worth it to look at it and say, well, you know what, this is really worth it. Let's be the only ones who actually browse this stuff, and that's also how you make it, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.